as India is celebrating Azadi Ka Amrit Mahotsav and also the United Nations is into its 77th year as the 77th UN GA is still on, how do you look at reforms in the United Nations?
I completely share your sentiment that 75 years or 77 years is adequate time to recognize the need for adjusting to changed reality. When the United Nations was formed in 1945, there were only 51 members. Today there are 193. The world has seen decolonization. The world has seen the end of the Cold War. And let me be very clear, the world has seen the rise of developing countries. This includes India, of course includes China. And so there's a shift from the transatlantic balance to the Indo-Pacific. Does this not require that the greatest and most important instrument of international governance, the United Nations, as well as the Bretton Woods institutions, adjust to this change? Now let me say a word about India. India was not favored in 1945, although we were a chartered member, by any kind of grandfathering in terms of a permanent membership of the Security Council. Perhaps understandable, we were a colony. We were also not the largest developing country. There was China, which was larger than us. But next year, India will become the largest country in the world in terms of people. We will be among the 3 or 4 largest economies in the world. And so, think about it from the perspective not just of India, but of the world, that doesn't it behove the world and the institutions of international governance that India should be inside the tent, i.e. de jure contributing to a better world and for the benefit of humankind through global good. I think the time has come. The time had come some time back also, but the situation is such that I think today even the naysayers as well as the current powers that be would be benefited by having a country like India and several others who are in the G4 to be inside the tent, because the global need of the hour is far greater heft than what they can provide only by themselves.
Yes, absolutely, Ambassador. Sir, I'd also like to know from you that recently after the Shanghai Cooperation Organization Summit in Samarkand, and when Prime Minister Modi said that this is not the time for war, rather today's era is not of war, there has been lot of outpouring of support for India's permanent membership in the United Nations Security Council, and in fact world leaders including President Biden have supported this move. And as you mentioned that the UN Security Council should be expanded and India must find its rightful place. So what does India do to reach that particular stage?
Mr. Roy, the fact that this is the time to wage peace, I think cannot go unnoticed.
Right.
I'm glad that what the Prime Minister said was echoed by President Macron. President Biden also mentioned it. The U.S. State Department National Security Advisor mentioned it. Look, we are facing major challenges, whether it's climate change, the need for sustainability, and several other things. And surely, and we've just gone through the COVID pandemic, surely we don't need old-fashioned stuff like war and hegemony. So this is a call which is not just timely, but which reminds people that let's be focused on our planet, on what is the global good for humankind as such. Now, India's unique position in terms of the Committee of Nations, which is striving for this change to reflect contemporary reality, is being increasingly recognized by everyone in the world. We are doing our bit, along with at least 3 other countries which form the group of 4, which includes Brazil, Japan and Germany.
Right,
2 major powers in the world, economic powers, which were left out at the end of the Second World War, being losers in that war. But things have changed, and frankly speaking, this change must come through sooner rather than later.
Right.
You asked me the question, what can we do? We have a good global coalition, both in the group of 4, which are countries which seriously coalesce a large amount of power across the world. We also have a large number of small developing countries, including island states, in the L69 who also want to see a change in the permanent membership of the Security Council, essentially in the power structure of the Security Council. But, we also need to reckon with reality. There are middle income or middling countries in the world which are loath to see a few go ahead. This includes countries even in our neighborhood. They would try to block any kind of reform. On the other hand, while individually, other than one, most of the permanent members echo support for India or even ideas of reform. The fact of the matter is, other than articulating once in a while, they're not really willing to make the great effort. Because if
True.
they did, then even the recalcitrant would be forced to think through.
Right.
It is a haul. It's a long haul. But let me say this. India is perhaps best positioned because we not just meet the criteria, but there is a great recognition that, frankly, having us inside the structures would benefit the structures and, in fact, the powers that be today, rather than having us out.
There have been questions from certain quarters about the veto power of the Security Council, because all the P5 members, they enjoy veto power, and we have seen how it is used on many occasions. And there have been calls for a relook at veto powers, especially in the 21st century. What is your opinion on that, since you have very closely worked in the United Nations system?
Well, Mr. Roy, when the United Nations was created in 1945, this veto power was given to the 5 countries, 3 of them victors of World War I, 1 a former colonial power, I'm referring to France, and 1, let me say, the others in the world, or representative of the others in the world, the largest developing country, China. Now, why did this happen? It happened because the experiences of international governance from before that, the League of Nations, were not very good, because this sort of power to block was extended to a large number. So, in a sense, it was victory for the winners. They took it, and, well, they've run with the world for 75 years. Is veto good or bad? Look, I come from India, where I believe that at the end of the day, it can't be just one country blocking things. Who are the countries who've been casting the vetoes? The United States, mostly in defense of Israel. The Chinese, in defense of North Korea. The Russians, in defense of several of their interests. Let me also tell you that India, took a big hit in 1948 with the Security Council making resolutions on Kashmir. And later on, much of this didn't go through because at least one of the major powers ensured that the Security Council would not move any kind of resolution against India. So it's not just casting the veto, but the threat of the veto, which matters. We've lost out and benefited.
Right, sir. And I would also like to know from you that at the 75th UNGA, when it was a virtual General Assembly, when addressing it, the Honorable Prime Minister Shri Narendra Modi said that it was time for reforms, and not only in the Security Council, but it is felt that the United Nations itself needs to reform itself. I would like to know your take on this, Ambassador.
So, Mr. Roy, the ideas that there should be reform across the board in the United Nations is not just obvious, but again reflects contemporary reality.
Right, sir.
When we look at the Security Council and its polarity-oriented system of veto, permanent membership, etc., that's one heavyweight side of decision-making. But there are so many other elements. It is how you make contributions, who are the people who man the principal administrative post there, how do decisions get taken, how much of inclusiveness is there. Let me give you one example. When the Millennium Development Goals, the MDGs mentioned at the turn of the century, they were an articulation by the Secretary General. No doubt a good articulation, which was in the interest of humankind. But was that really the way of going about it? Didn't it require that the large committee of nations in the General Assembly at least debate them and then go ahead and give a go-ahead for it? Ideally, negotiate them among each other. Well, when it came to the Sustainable Development Goals, many people would have liked that the Sustainable Development Goals reflect the priorities in the year 2015 of basically the developed world, climate change, etc. And hunger, poverty, education, nutrition would perhaps have been relegated. But the developing world came together. And this is the beauty of the system of the United Nations. While polarity has its own place, but in the larger things which require a global buy-in, we have inclusivity and we have the question of bringing everyone together. They may not agree, but they've been participating in the process, and hence there's a de jure sanction to what gets agreed, the Sustainable Development Goals being an outstanding example.
And as you rightly mentioned about the global commons and also India's take on those global commons, how India has been doing its own bit to take on climate change and other issues, and also India's links with small developing island nations and these things. The mantra today, some say, would be perform, reform and transform. What would you like to add to that, sir?
I completely agree with you there. Reform and transform are two sides of one coin. As far as perform is concerned, let me make one point for your listener. The United Nations is not global government, but global governance. So perform is really for all of us as a collective committee. Of course, we have set up structures of common endeavor like the United Nations Development Program, like various other institutional arrangements allow for collaborative action, and we must act together out there. But reform is that of the structures of global governance. And if they start reflecting contemporary reality, would they not be in a better position to A, understand, and B, respond to the contemporary needs of humankind?
And on that note, we thank you so much for joining us in this lively discussion. Thank you, Ambassador Manjeev Singh Puri.
Mr. Roy, thank you.